Introducing the Erotics of Wounding, Sex, Violence, and the Body by Jeff Hearn and Viv Burr. Sex, Violence, the Body. Sex, Violence, the Body. Any one of these alone alerts complex emotions, questions of power, feelings around vulnerability, even awareness of existence, mortality, and life themselves. Put together, various connections and permutations of sex, violence, and the body suggest further challenges and indeed often considerable uncertainties, contestations, and ambivalences. For example, sexual violences, such as rape and sexual assault, can be understood from one point of view as specific forms of often male sexuality, and then, from another point of view, not as sexuality, but rather as forms of violence. There is a vast literature and a large set of public debates on the relations of sex and violence in pornography, prostitution, the sex trade more generally, sexual violence and abuse, eroticization of violence, sadomasochism, S&M, bondage and dominance, BND, visual media, censorship, and so on. However, the extent to which commentaries on such political matters are explicitly embodied varies considerably. Even if they are clearly matters of the body, they are not always located within an explicit politics of the body and body power. The reference to the body here is necessarily broad and open-ended. This is not least because different contributors address very different bodily practices, social relations, and representations of the body, bodies. Suffice it to say at this stage, we take a social view of the body and embodiment, but that does not suggest a social essentialism. As in some constructionist and postmodernist versions, bodies do exist, are matter, and do matter. They can be and are violated and damaged. In this book, the sex-violence-body nexus is approached through a specific focus on the erotics of wounding, breaking skin, and injuring bodies. While wounding and potential wounding is our primary concern, it is not always possible to make clear distinctions from violence and violation more generally. This introductory chapter seeks to synthesize some of the main ideas in the book, clarify conceptual issues, and articulate some of the debates and challenges. Wounding and its erotics. In this book, we present a range of contributions that examine the relations between sexuality, violence, and the body by way of the erotics of wounding. When we began this project focusing on wounding some years ago, it seemed at times a somewhat specialist concern. The social and psychological significance of wounding and injury has been studied in relation to a variety of phenomena, for example, S&M practices, sex crimes, body modification, cosmetic surgery, pornography, self-mutilation, and self-injury. At the same time, in many anthropological studies, there is extensive research on scarification, tattooing, and forms of wounding, often as part of initiation or generational rites of passage. In some such contexts, wounding may have positive connotations, often with clear gendered meanings, sometimes overtly sexual meanings. However, the more we, as editors, explore these concerns, with the inspiration of colleagues and contributors, the more we realized that the erotics of wounding are widely pervasive and embedded within many general and pervasive cultural forms in war, militarism, surgery and medicine, film, fantasy, religion, art, aesthetics, beauty, fashion, sport, ordinary sexual practice and imagery, and not least in the recurrent relation of sex and death. Wounding is a central feature of various religious and spiritual traditions, not least in the idea of Christ's wounds. Penance and bodily self-mortification recur in many religions' traditions, for example in Muslim self-flagellation of the back or chest, and in the use of the Silas by Opus Dei Catholic numeraries. Importantly, transgression is a major theme in constructions of erotics and sexuality. Is not the most erotic portion of a body where the garment gapes. It is intermittence, which is erotic. Births. Wounding is one form of transgression. We see the specific focus on wounding as a productive approach, partly because it makes the embodied nature of the relations of sex and violence more explicit, more speakable, more fully articulated for interrogation. To put this differently, attending to wounding, breaking skin, and injuring bodies, along with their erotics, impels clearer confrontation with embodiment. Despite the assertion that human sex takes place mainly in the head, the doing of the relations of sex and violence produce, perform, do, invoke, and represent the body and bodies. The sexual body is constituted in the intersection of corporeality, cultural discourses, and institutions. These social relations are typically intensely gendered and subject to and part of gender and intersectional power relations. These gendered relations occur not only in particular individual and interpersonal bodily events and practices, but also at cultural, structural, and societal levels. These latter social processes are also increasingly transnational and transsocietal in character, as is the spread of pornography and the sex trade through information and communication technology. The concept of wounding, used here as a shorthand for bodily wounding, breaking skin, and the injuring of bodies, deserves some further analytical and conceptual attention. We see the cutting or breaking of skin as a prime concern, as in some legal definitions of wounding. This may be with or without consent, a term that raises multiple legal and ethical complications. However, it is also necessary to use the term at times in a broader way in some chapters. In particular, there is the question of the relations of the direct physical wounding of the body through breaking of the skin, however accomplished, and less specific forms of wounding, as in emotional and psychological wounding. Thus, how the boundaries around the topic are discussed and defined deserve close attention. A number of dimensions can readily be seen as relevant: degree of damage or injury, whether injury is self-inflicted, other-inflicted, or naturally occurring. For example, is body-piercing wounding or adornment? The boundary between breaking of the skin and wounding through bruising, the extent to which the damage or injury carries what are principally sexual or non-sexual, for example, aesthetic or medical, meanings, whether any sexual meanings are almost entirely personal, for example, self-harm, or culturally shared, for example, circumcision, and the relations between physical wounding and non-physical wounding. While most chapters attend primarily to physical wounding, this is not always so, and indeed the separation of physical and non-physical wounding may be problematic. The chapter by Michelle Jones and Jeff Hearn on women's experiences of violence from male partners and ex-partners is especially relevant here, as is Mona Liveholt's chapter on textual representation by journalists and researchers of rape, sexual assault, and attempted murder. Such violence, whether by known assailants or strangers, can mean both physical and non-physical damage. Psychological violence, control, and wounding, particularly in long-term relationships, can have dire effects on those victimized and their sense of self. Textual violence both builds on these relations and has its own power dynamics. In a different way, the broad phenomenon of wounding can include risk or threat of being wounded, as discussed in Victoria Robinson's chapter on rock climbing and extreme sports. What this brief discussion illustrates is that there is a need for some precision in distinguishing between wounding as a general and sometimes extended social process of temporary or permanent damage, the wounder, the wounded, the wounds produced, and the wounds healed, as in cosmetic surgery or healed wounds after scarification in initiation. In some contexts, wounds are best understood as a process, at other times as an object of attention, a thing, even a fetish, that comes to be eroticized. In terms of sexual desire, a considerable number of connections with wounding are possible. These include desire of for the wounder, desire of for the wounded, and desire for the wound. There are of course possible in-between positions between desire of and desire for, in terms of ambiguities and changing positions in sexual and related relations over time or across biographies. In addition, and perhaps more controversially, the wound itself or the production of the wound may, for some, be constitutive of sexuality and erotics. Sexualized or sexualed relations to wounding may be from the perspective of the wounder, whether the self, mutually, by proxy or others, for example the sadistic, or those wounded, for example the masochistic, or others as observers. More specifically, and as represented simply in Table 1.1, the wounder or the wounded, or indeed others, can relate to wounding in sexually positive or sexually negative terms, or indeed ambiguously. Table 1.1, sexually positive and negative positions of the wounder and the wounded. So, when you have sexually positive wounder, that's the sadistic position. When you have sexually positive wounded, that's the masochistic position. When you have sexually negative wounder, that's the regretful position. and when you have sexually negative wounded, that's the violated position. For some or in some situations, wounds and wounding may be given meaning as sexually positive, may be celebrated, sometimes aggressively so. Sexual identification may take place with this position, as when wounds are signs of sexual initiation and maturity, or as in sexual arousal by wounds in rape or other sexual crimes. Another example is the sexualization of more institutional practices, such as corporal punishment. Alternatively, those who are wounded may be identified with, in seeing their wounds and wounding, as negative, damaging, and something to be condemned, but still as sexually relevant. In this, sexual experience or identification is with the sufferer. Indeed, the wounded hero, the damaged victim, the wounded self, may be or in turn may become desirable. This is not necessarily a masochistic position or identification. Rather, it may draw on associations of care, comfort, and sex, and in that sense, it can be compatible with nonviolent sexualities. Such interlinking constructions of erotic wounds, identities, and subjectivities may often be structured in terms of dichotomies, for example, heterosexual, non-heterosexual, and reproductive, non-reproductive sex and sexualities. Sexuality can relate to wounding for those directly involved, and for others not so directly implicated. For example, there are those identifying with one or more parties. Such identifications are especially important in understanding representations of wounding, and viewers and other users' relations thereto. Further complex positionings may also be elaborated, for example, within mutual S&M, interlinked matrices of subjectivities, changing sexual preferences across biographies, or paradoxical psychoanalytics. All these positions are used in visual media, film, television, video, and pop culture. As regards those who are less directly involved in doing wounding or being wounded, there is a range of possibilities. Such observers can include those who are directly, less directly, or indirectly involved. They may be actively involved or passively uninvolved. They can be analysts or actors, for example, as medical or legal actors. The wounding may be done by proxy, as discussed by Sheila Jeffries in her chapter on bodily mutilation and modification, including cosmetic surgery, in relation to postmodernism and feminism. Taina Kinnunen addresses similar questions, more specifically from the viewpoint of the women seeking such surgeries. These kinds of proxy wounding are seen by some, probably an increasing number, as respectable, and have become remarkably popular in recent years. They are also strongly international in their appeal, with the greatest concentrations of activity in the US, Spain, Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil, with the UK not far behind with 577,000 cosmetic treatments in 2007. Spain boasts the headquarters of Corporación Dermoestética, the first plastic surgery company in Europe trading on the stock exchange. Plastic surgery is also popular in Iran. Turkey is becoming a lead country in Botox treatments. In some contexts, such wounding interventions are given liberatory meanings as signs of sexual freedom by the wounders or the wounded. According to some commentators, this can even be seen as a reaction to previous political authoritarianism, as in the Spanish case. From a very different perspective, others stress the humane benefits of such surgical interventions as part of advocacy for individual control and conventional, often white, beauty ideals. Social practices and social representations. The book covers a range of forms of damage and injury, both in concrete social practices and in representations. It seeks to contribute to long-established general discussions on the relations of the real and representational, and to recent debates on the relations of the social human and the biological human, and of things such as weapons and texts, and people such as wounders and wounded. In particular, it operates across the border of analyses of social practices and analyses of social representations. In this regard, an interesting contrast can be made between Annie Richte's chapter on SM social practices and fictional writing and representations on BDSM, discussed in Jenny Alexander's chapter. This quickly brings us to some complex debates. On the one hand, there are real differences between direct wounding of real flesh, of you or me, and representations of wounding, which may or may not be representations of previous or real-time actual wounding. On the other hand, there are, to complicate matters, all sorts of connections and crossovers between wounding practices and representations of wounding. For a start, representations are practices and are the result of practices. Representations can have very harmful effects and effects that are experienced as harmful, as in the production of pornography and consequent degradations, the use of the N-word, or cartoons of the divine. However, a further important point is context. Sentences like, "he wounded her and she enjoyed it," and "he was wounded and he enjoyed it," can have very different meanings and effects depending on context. Slippages around these questions of practice representation are one, but not the only, reason for the degree of disagreements between analysts and commentators on these issues, including between some of our contributors. Divergences in approach build on established and related differences around pornography and prostitution, even though these debates have their own specific character. Displaying the suffering and wounding of others is not straightforward, not least because of the existence of already well-worn, predictable forms of representation, or, to put it differently, the assimilation of violent erotic images with violent erotic acts creates moral and methodological confusions which do not necessarily strengthen critiques of either violence or representation. On the contrary, such assimilations may indicate a collusion between viewer and viewed to the extent that the official version of things has become reality. Let us take just one example of these linkages across practices and representations, that of pain. While pain is highly medicalized in modern society, beliefs about pain are deeply socially and culturally embedded. Illness narratives have elaborated pain experiences by focusing on the person and using concepts such as biological disruption, narrative reconstruction, and illness adjustment, thus allowing for emotional and cultural frameworks. However, visual imagery and the complex rapport between art and pain also have a key role. Links between pain and emotional suffering have long had erotic overtones, as in the relations between martyrdom and sadomasochism. These various perspectives on wounding can thus overlap and interconnect in representations and social practices. Many genres and traditions engage with violence and wounding. A great number of classical, often firmly patriarchal, texts and works of art have shown complex links between sex, violence, and wounding. These range from the conjunction of sex and death, for example Eros and Thanatos in classical Greek drama and Abrahamic religious texts, to grand opera, for example Puccini's Tosca 1900 and Strauss's Salome 1905. Many visual artists have engaged heavily in this terrain, from Bosch and his medieval horrors to Caravaggio in The Flagellation, 1606, and his erotic mixing of armored bodies and naked bodies, to Max Ernst in The Blessed Virgin chastising the infant Jesus before 3 witnesses, 1926. Beliefs about pain and suffering linked to sexuality and wounding are represented in the iconic images of pain, such as Gerrit von Honthorst's San Sebastian, 1590, and Frida Kahlo's The Broken Column, 1944. In particular, various Renaissance depictions of Saint Sebastian and other martyred saints were spawned by a small industry of artists, and since then supplemented by imitators and commentators attesting its painful, homoerotic allure. Andrea Mantegna painted Saint Sebastian circa 1457, with arrows entering his head from opposite directions, and with another aimed at his groin. Tanzio de Varallo depicted the saint tended by angels, circa 1620, in an ambiguous masochistic rapture of emotion and pain. These images remain highly resonant today. With reference back to Saint Sebastian, and drawing on the works of Yukio Mishima and Eric Jordan, Owen Heathcote has analyzed links between martyrdom, masochism, sadism, and homotextuality. In this, he exposes and magnifies homosexual exposure and homosexuality as exposure. For example, the masochistically aestheticized theme of containment and concealment in the narrative. This kind of exploration interrogates the complex relations between desire, violence, and literature, and between the violence of representation and violence in representation.